What is neurodiversity?
What is it about these people?
Dyslexia,
autism spectrum,
ADHD,
Gifted,
dysgraphia.
All brains are different.
It's okay to be who you are.
This is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Hey there, and welcome to episode 91. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. Today, we are talking about how to create a neurodiversity-affirming world with psychologist Joel Schwartz. It's a really interesting interview, and I'm excited to share it with you. So if you've been listening to the podcast, you know I'm the author of a new book, Teaching Twice Exceptional Learners in Today's Classroom, from Free Spirit Publishing. I'm so excited that this book is actually going to be out in the world in just a little over 2 weeks. It's been a really long process, which was made even longer due to the pandemic, so having the release date so close feels just a little bit surreal. If you want to order it early, you can. We actually have a discount and free shipping on our website, neurodiversitypodcast.com. One more thing before we jump in with Joel Schwartz. Executive functioning is a hot topic these days. You should join me at the Executive Functioning Online Summit. Seth Perler, who's been on the podcast, is hosting this event, and you can attend either for free if you attend live, or you can purchase an all-access pass to get all of the recordings and even some other bonus stuff. There's a link in the show notes if you'd like to register. Coming up.
Hi, I'm Dr. Joel Schwartz. I'm a neurodivergent clinical psychologist in California who specializes in working with neurodivergent people from a neurodiversity affirmative standpoint.
Joel is next.
As a new school year approaches, educators and school administrators are looking for new and better ways of identifying, supporting, and challenging gifted and twice exceptional students. A new book by Emily Kircher-Morris, Teaching Twice Exceptional Learners in Today's Classroom, gives you guidelines for identifying and understanding 2E students, helps you provide strength-based instruction, motivate them, and help them with self-regulation. It contains important information to help educators advocate for 2E students, including what they need to know about individualized education plans, or IEPs, and the Section 504 plan process. This important new book is now available for pre-order, and we're giving our listeners a 25% discount off the regular price. Go to neurodiversitypodcast.com, click the link, and enter the promo code 2EBOOK to buy the book and get the discount. Teaching Twice Exceptional Learners in Today's Classroom. Available for pre-order now and on store shelves August 24th.
You're listening to the
Neurodiversity Podcast. Today we're talking with Dr. Joel Schwartz about creating a neurodiversity-affirming world. And so, Joel, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
I'm really happy to be here. I love what you're doing. Thank you.
I've been really looking forward to this conversation because I know that you are a strong advocate for creating a neurodiversity-affirming environment, whether that is in the clinical setting, in schools and homes, or the world in general. As a starting point for our conversation, I kind of just want to hear, what are your ideas about what a neurodiversity affirming world means to you? Like, what would this utopian world look like?
Oh, it's hard to find a utopian world because there are so many conflicting needs at once. I guess the biggest thing is a world where people's divergent needs are understood and validated as real and necessary, as well as society putting forward finances, accommodations, help to really maximize the lives of folks who may be different. A lot of that, I think, comes from this, American idea we have to all be so independent and super functional and work at jobs that really don't benefit anybody except for the people on top. And recognizing that there are so many different ways of having a valuable life. And just because it doesn't match my way of having a valuable life doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a world where others have access to what's valuable for them.
I love that. Why don't we back up just a bit and talk a little bit specifically about your background and how you got into this work. Mm-hmm. So I know that you're a clinical psychologist who supports neurodivergent clients, and you're also neurodivergent yourself.
Yes.
Can you share a little bit about how being neurodivergent has influenced your development and understanding on the topics related to this cause?
Yeah. So I was diagnosed ADHD as a much, much younger person, but it wasn't really treated isn't the right word, worked with, honored. It was just kind of this thing that we sort of knew I had. Um, my parents, I guess, tried meds on me, but it zombied me out. And they just kind of said, nope, we're not going to, try anything else. Um, and so I, was lucky to have come from a family culture, been gifted with a brain that was somewhat interested in academics. And I was able to get through college pretty well without accommodations. Always, waiting till the last minute, pulling all-nighters, getting myself completely sick, but able to at least, do it and pass college pretty well. I got to grad school where the workload suddenly increased, and that was just a tough, traumatizing part of my life. I didn't understand why I couldn't do the things I used to be able to do. I sort of knew it might have to do with ADHD, but I didn't really know what that meant or how to really work with that. I wasn't aware of resources out there. The faculty didn't really know what to do about that. And I really faltered. The rest of my class, graduated, took me an extra 4 years to finish my classes and get my dissertation done to finally graduate. And that whole traumatic shaming experience was the beginning, as well as marrying into a family that we know that my son is autistic, but we found out that my wife as well into the marriage was. And that kind of started me off on this tangent of what does the female presenting autism presentation look like, and we started delving into that. And from there, just discovered the neurodiversity paradigm, and that was maybe about 6 years ago. Fully embraced it. I have been educating myself, changing the way I think about things and work ever since, and it's culminated in a very vibrant career and starting this Facebook community of now 6,000 people, where neurodiversity is my bread and butter as my business, but it also is my bread and butter in life. That without this idea, my own life wouldn't work, my marriage wouldn't work, my family wouldn't work. It became necessary to understand and accept these neurological differences for us all to have lives that work well for us.
Yeah, the neurodiversity movement has really, just has grown so much, because I think my awareness of it probably began around the same time that yours did. I had been in a clinical setting and was working with a lot of kids who were coping okay. They were kind of getting by, but not really. There was a reason that they were in my office.
Right.
And looking back now and understanding so much more about neurodiversity and I can look back and go, okay, well, that was a diagnosis that clearly nobody had picked up on, at that particular time.
Right.
And I feel like that has really influenced my work with my clients.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And when we come from this medical model DSM framework that is inherently stigmatizing of anybody who experiences life differently, but particularly these neurological differences, because they aren't disorders. They're not something that went wrong with somebody's life and disrupted their life due to trauma. It's how somebody was born. And when we've painted this in such a stigmatizing way, and clinicians are afraid to diagnose because they might be wrong or they might be stigmatizing somebody, or it's such a big label, you're really denying people a sense of agency and identity, a sense of being able to thrive in the world by understanding who they are, how they work, and what they need in order to succeed in their own way.
Let's talk a little bit more about what you just mentioned. A major component of the neurodiversity movement is the goal of changing the language surrounding neurodiversity and diagnosis, because, as you mentioned, psychology has for a long time pathologized traits that we see in neurodivergent people. So what are some of the changes that you see happening with language, and why is this such an important piece? And I guess, how can people continue to do that in their own lives?
I think the biggest change in language we see is the embracing of identity first language among autistic people. So I just used it, instead of using people with autism or on the autism spectrum, which seek to separate autism from the person. And you hear this a lot, you're not your autism, you're so much more. Well, when it's something that's inherent to how you sense, how you feel, how you interpret, how you react, it's an inherent part of who you are. There's no separating your neurology from who you are. It's not like, depression, which might be periodic. But for those of us who are neurodivergent, there is no separating it. So there's this idea of embracing it as an identity instead of a pathology. So we're seeing people use autistic person. In many ways, you see that in the disability community. I'm a deaf person instead of I'm a person who's hearing impaired. I'm a blind person. And there's an embracing of identity. With ADHD, we don't have a term, unfortunately, that is non-pathologizing because the D is in there. So we're seeing a lot of people calling themselves an ADHD-er or an ADH-er, taking the D out of it. I call myself an attentionally different and hyper-interested dude. So there is this embracing of the idea of I'm not a person with ADHD, I'm an ADHD-er or an ADH-er, and hopefully we can develop some kind of language around ADHD that isn't pathologizing. And also doesn't miss the whole point of it, because ADHD is a misnomer. That's not really what having ADHD is about. It's not a deficit of attention. It's a different use of attention with both strengths and weaknesses. And so calling it a deficit and focusing on attention is a big reason why there's so much misdiagnosis and misidentification and misunderstanding.
This type of neurology can be disabling, but a lot of times that's more, if you look at the social model of disability, it's more about the fact that we don't provide accommodations. I agree with the people who would say, oh, well, ADHD is my superpower, that's really minimizing, that doesn't really take into account, the reality of that. But there are some characteristics that come along with it that we don't maybe, that aren't all bad.
Mm-hmm. I'm very keen on both ideas. So just personally, when COVID hit and so many people were faltering and freaking out, I was like, I already have this online presence that I've cultivated because I love new technology, novel and shiny things. I was very easily able to pivot. I came up with like 25 amazing ideas. Sometimes it's hard to focus on one of those ideas, but with a little bit of help and a little bit of consultation with folks. And I was able to pivot in a way that allowed our business to grow and be pretty successful. And I think that's directly tied to my ADHD. And there have been many times in my life where when other people are in crisis, that's when I've got all the ideas and time kind of slows down and I can see things that other people don't. And in a way, that is a superpower. Mm-hmm. But it's also incredibly disabling in other contexts. And I think that's the main thing, is that it's all contextual. And most of the context in which neurodivergent people live is geared towards neurotypical functioning. And so these arbitrary things like you have to learn this skill in one semester of school and get graded on it, and that affects the rest of your life. Well, why is a semester a thing? Why is a quarter a thing?
Right.
Why can't I learn that over a year and a half? And maybe that year and a half, I actually mastered it better than the person who, just kind of, figured it out in a semester and then left it. Forgetting to pay bills and things like that. If there was some kind of accommodation where I could register as an ADHDer and they could give me a little leeway and some extra, I know this is kind of utopian, but if that was something there, then I wouldn't be late on bills. I wouldn't, miss things. I wouldn't have late fees. Little things like that can make a difference. But it is very disabling, and it does cause us to struggle terribly, and it causes so much shame. And disability isn't a bad word. I think for a long time, a big issue that I had, and I see with many struggle with, is because I didn't want to seem disabled, I wanted to do it all myself. And then I just ended up digging myself in a deeper hole, when really all I needed to say was, I can't do it in this context. I am disabled here, and I need to accommodate myself in A, B, C, and D and make this happen in a different way. And if I had just years ago said it's okay to be disabled in this context, and I'm okay identifying as that, I would have saved myself so much heartache. But there was no, talking about this in my psychology program. There was no way to have this language. It was all, pathology and disability is bad, and the inherent ableism in the way that we are trained. So just incorporating ideas from the social model of disability and neurodiversity, I think, could save people so much time and effort and resources and shame and horrific experiences. I know it would have done so for me.
Just sharing experiences. I was diagnosed with ADHD as a kid and took meds, that were, I don't know, mildly to moderately effective, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really know until I was about in high school and I stopped. Then I spent the next 10 to 15 years on and off of different anxiety and depression medications.
Right.
Because I couldn't get couldn't get my act together. And finally I decided I was going to go try some ADHD meds again. And for me, it was truly life-changing, and it worked for me. I'm not saying it works for everybody,
right.
But my anxiety basically went away because all of those executive functioning issues that I have, not that they're not still there, but they're manageable in a different way.
Right.
And I think that that's part of that stigma. It's like I had internalized all of that for so long. Like, oh, no, it's not ADHD. I should be able to handle all of this on my own. And finally just being able to ask for help and recognize that I can't do it all on my own. That's okay.
Right.
There are tools out there to help.
That's exactly right. And part of that is that psychiatric idea of disorder, that haunts us all, is that if our brains are broken and we have a chemical imbalance, which we don't, there is no lack of dopamine in our brains, it's just handled differently. If we look at it as an imbalance or a disorder, then there's something inherently shameful. I'm broken. I need this med to, make myself human, to make myself neurotypical, to make myself better. And that's hard. But if we look at it as, in some contexts, I'm disabled. And, just like when I hurt my back, I might need a wheelchair to get around for a few days if it's bad enough. There's nothing wrong with asking for that help, with accommodating myself with that. And if I'm more chronically disabled, then a wheelchair is absolutely necessary to get around. There's nothing about me that's inherently bad or wrong. It's just, this is what I need to succeed. And if we look at medication as the wheelchair, as an accommodation, instead of as fixing something, that's inherently wrong with our brains, I think that can be very empowering.
Let's talk for a second about ABA, because no conversation about reframing neurodiversity is complete without at least touching on it. And you actually had a bit of an encounter with ABA therapy early on. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
So I went to UCLA undergrad, which is where ABA was developed. And I was in a abnormal psychology class where we talked about autism and ABA, and there was some recruiting being done to an ABA clinic. And so I did a year between college and grad school working in an ABA clinic because I didn't know any better.
As many of us didn't at the,
Right, right. But that has never been part of my actual practice. Once I got to grad school and learned about, psychodynamic ideas and trauma, and really started to identify ways in which ableism had deeply affected and shamed me, I couldn't stomach ABA anymore. And that was actually the beginning of it, is that I got a summer job in the middle of grad school at an ABA clinic. And I failed out within weeks because I just couldn't handle it anymore. I was looking at it and it disgusted me. And I had this kind of radical change. And now I'm an ABA abolitionist.
So for those who might not be familiar, ABA stands for Applied Behavioral Analysis. And it is a method that is based in behavioralism and really is used often with autistic people. And there's a lot of controversy about it right now. Not to get too deep into the weeds with all of it, but I think that it's important to really explore why the conversation about ABA is changing so much now. I think for a long time it was just kind of accepted that this is what we did for autistic individuals, and it can be very harmful.
Right.
What made you an ABA abolitionist? Like, what is it about it that is so harmful?
So ABA was created by a psychologist at UCLA named Ivar Lovaas. And Lovaas and his partner started out behaviorally modifying feminine boys to be more masculine. His partner, I forget his name, went on to found gay conversion therapy in the United States. So this is the start of ABA, was converting autistic people to act and look neurotypical. Lovaas believed that autistic people weren't human. He actually says this, you don't have a full human, and that you have to mold them to be human. It uses radical behaviorism. It ignores internal states, beliefs, sensory issues, values, feelings, attachment, everything that makes humans humans and that good psychology sees as essential to growth. And so basically ABA is taking people and behaviorally modifying them to act and be in ways that are deemed okay by other people, not necessarily the person themselves.
Yeah.
As a result, we have a whole generation of completely traumatized autistic people who are coming into clinics everywhere. And they may not even be aware of this, but they act neurotypical. They can kind of suppress their autisticness, but they're full of shame. They're full of ableism. They hate themselves. They feel disconnected from themselves. Every time they betray that they're autistic, they go into PTSD meltdowns because somebody might see who they really are. And they were trained since, being 2 years old to act differently. And a lot of people look at it and they say, oh, the kid is liking their therapist. They're getting, candy or love or something in response to it, but it's grooming. It's, I'm going to give you love and rewards if you act as I want you to, as I am leading you to be, instead of looking at who a child is and kind of enhancing it and building scaffolding in order to allow them to emerge in their own way, in a way that feels authentic to them, is kind to them, looks at their inherent interests, the way that they attach, the way that they love, the way that they express themselves. So there's a lot of violence built into ABA.
Well, I think even beyond ABA, a lot of behavioral techniques are under a lot of scrutiny within the neurodiversity movement.
Yeah.
Even when you talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, it's like, well, is it really taking into account a person's true lived experience?
Right.
I think the thing with ABA is that it is so much more blatant in a lot of ways. Like, I remember a kiddo that I worked with, and he would, stim when he would get excited and happy by flapping his hands. And he would come in and goes, well, my teacher and parents are wanting me, they want me to have quiet hands. It's like, why?
Right.
That is an emotionally regulating activity. It's not hurting him or anyone else. It's like, why do we care? I don't understand. It's like because he might look weird or something, or someone might think he's different. Well, that's a societal issue.
Exactly. There are a lot of more modern ABA people who have moved beyond that, who I think are doing a much more humane job. However, the basis of it is still compliance. It's still behaviorism. It's still based on goals that aren't really the child's, which are sometimes hard to parse out, obviously, especially if you have difficulty communicating. But then the idea is, let's work with speech folks who specialize in communication, and communication isn't behavioral based. I mean, this is like the first lesson of most psychology programs when you look at language, is that there are deep structures of language and it isn't behavioral based. It's an inherent part of who we are, although behavioral principles might be part of it. And I think behaviorism, there is a science to it, and you can get really robust results using behaviorism, but it has to be in concert with attachment, emotions, belief, culture, all these other things that make us human. So an ABA explicitly says we ignore all of that. We're just behavior. And once you stop doing just behavior, you stop doing ABA. That's what they say.
I think another topic that a lot of people are talking about is adults who are really coming to understand their own neurodivergence once, for example, their kids are diagnosed or whatever the trigger is, and which brings up the topic of self-diagnosis. What are your thoughts about self-diagnosis in the neurodiversity community, and how does being a psychologist influence your perspective on it?
I think that in general, self-diagnosis is valid. There's so much information out there, so much community out there, so many ideas out there that frankly run counterintuitive to what psychology teaches, that a lot of times the self-diagnoses are more valid than the formal diagnoses, because the diagnoses that we use, especially based on DSM criteria, are inaccurate, especially when it comes to ADHD and autism. The DSM criteria is overt behaviors which can change through time, which can be accommodated for, which can be masked, and not internal experiences. And really, there are very common internal experiences to all autistic people, and there are common experiences to all ADHD people. And when you kind of get to understand what those are and learn about them from a lived experience perspective, it's not terribly hard to diagnose these conditions. Now, some people would say, well, what if you're wrong? So I'm this person who has been misunderstood my whole life, and I don't connect well to others, and in reality, I might have schizoid personality disorder. But on the way to that, I find the autism community, and I identify as autistic for a couple of years. And in a way, I understand myself, and it's not the complete picture, but there might be some experiences. Then I, go to a professional psychologist later, and it turns out that I actually have schizoid PD. So, who did that really harm? Did you, fool people? And if you made some contacts based on that, does it really change anything about those contacts? I mean, you just say, hey, I was wrong. I'm sorry. Big deal, right?
Yeah.
And the lack of access to services is a huge issue. Psychologists are overbooked. Our testing is very expensive, often not done well. And to expect that people have to go through this $1,000 process. I know that in some places there's insurance. I know that in some countries there's access through socialized medicine, but still the wait lists are incredibly long. The process is really difficult. A lot of times psychologists get it wrong unless they have very specific experience with the internal aspects of this, and many just don't. It's just based on what they've read in the psychological literature, which is terribly inadequate.
Actually, as you're talking, I'm also thinking like some level of self-diagnosis is necessary even to start that process. You have to recognize that there's something going on and know what question to ask. The question I always ask clients is like, what do we need the diagnosis for?
Right.
Do we need something official? Do we need medication, or do we need a 504 plan or an IEP? Or
right.
If we need that official label for something, okay, well, then let's pursue it.
That's right. And the other kind of conceptual shift I think that's important is when we look at it as an identity and not a diagnosis, that kind of changes the permission around it, right? Is if I have identified as a, Russian Jew, which I sort of am for years, and then I do the deep dive into my ancestry and I find, we actually come from Hungary. Okay, now I'm Hungarian. So,
Right.
So there's this idea of you have to have the right diagnosis. Like, no, it's an exploration process. It's an identity. People are constantly exploring their identity. You can change your religion. You can, change your ethnicity if you realize that you come from a different place. And when you're searching for your identity, I think there's going to be missteps along the way. That's okay. That doesn't bother me. Why does that bother so many psychologists? I'm not very fond of my profession right now. There's so much gatekeeping and such a lack of humility when it comes to lived experience. I tend to find other psychologists very frustrating right now.
Yeah. I've got to say, so I'm a master's level clinician as a LPC, licensed professional counselor here in Missouri. But because of the population that I work with, and because this is my area of both passion and expertise, I see people coming in with flat out wrong diagnoses
all the time.
I had a kiddo who I worked with, and it was like, he was cognitively gifted, so he masked really, really well. He was clearly autistic. It was like such a process, first of all, for us to really understand him and to talk to the parents and get the parents over the stigma of the diagnosis. And then we did need some accommodations, and we finally went and got an outside evaluation, like a full different, came back with a diagnosis of depression. I'm like, this is not right, because now that then limits what accommodations and services are available to him.
There's a fundamental disrespect for the experience of others, as if somehow if your experience and how you're living contradicts my education, it somehow threatens me as a psychologist. It doesn't. You know, I see so many clients in my assessment practice where they've brought in, these deep lists of their experiences that completely match with, an identification of autism or ADHD. Mm-hmm. And other psychologists have just completely dismissed it. I copy and paste that right into my reports. I say, here's the criteria, here's what they say they're experiencing. It may not be spiking in all the tests, but in some of the tests it is. But most importantly, here's what they experience. Let's start with that. Why is that such an issue?
Yeah. Well, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I know I could keep you on here and chat with you all day, but let's wrap up with this. So if you were talking to someone who had just learned that they were neurodivergent and they're trying to unwrap all of those past experiences that they've had and the emotions that come with that new level of self-awareness, what would you say to them? What advice would you want them to hear?
So many thoughts come to mind. The one that sort of sits at the top of my head is to research the social theory of disability. I think that becomes very important. Second, I would say find your people, go online, go on, even though social media can sometimes be a hairy place and there's a lot of weird gatekeeping in the advocacy community as well, finding people who share your experiences and normalize them can be profoundly healing. And then I would say kind of go back through your life and think about all of these times that you felt shame and you felt less than, and try to kind of reconfigure your memory around them from the social disability framework, that there wasn't anything wrong with you, that it was prejudice and misunderstanding and stupid cultural ideas that went unchallenged. And you can take a lot of that trauma and reprocess it in a way that can be very empowering and say, now you know what you need and who you are, and you can empower yourself to ask for help and to let people know who you are instead of cowering in shame. Even if they react poorly to you, that's on them. That's not you.
Dr. Joel Schwartz, thank you so much for the conversation today.
Thank you. It was fun. Good to see you and meet you in person.
What would a neurodiversity-affirming world look like for you? In my mind, the first step to creating a neurodiversity-affirming world is to erase the stigma surrounding neurodivergent diagnoses. Autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia. These are variations of human brain development. As neurodivergent people, we might navigate the world a little differently than the way society has developed it. But the changes we're requesting aren't huge. A bit of understanding, a bit of empathy, can go a long way in helping everyone live comfortable and fulfilling lives. The mission of this podcast is to normalize neurodiversity, and we're glad that you're here with us. Let's get to work. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
A tip of the hat again to Joel Schwartz. We've placed a link to his Neurodiversity-Affirming Therapist Facebook group in the show notes at neurodiversitypodcast.com. While you're on our website, you might want to check out the Free Executive Function Online Summit, August 20th through 22nd. It features Seth Perler, along with, of course, Emily and many other experts. And if you can't make it on that weekend, you can get access to the whole summit, along with some extra bonus stuff for a really low price. See the details at neurodiversitypodcast.com. For Emily, I'm executive producer Dave Morris. Stay safe, stay healthy. See you next time. This is a production of Morris Creative Services.